Hello, I am this thing, and today I'm gonna be analyzing the level design, as well as the general game design of Rayman 3. I'm doing this because I'm a level designer by trade, and Rayman 3 is one of my all-time favorite games, so this is long overdue. In fact, it's one of, if not the first game I ever played through from start to finish, after becoming obsessed with it thanks to a demo disc from a McDonald's Happy Meal, and begging my parents to get it for me for my birthday. Perhaps you have a similar story. I'll also be comparing it to the previous two games from time to time, which is why I just gave you that nostalgia disclaimer. This video isn't gonna be about picking favorites or anything though. It's more about highlighting examples of what's generally considered good and bad design practice, and explaining why. Either way, please hit the Patreon button and consider subscribing to my like and comment. That is, if you actually enjoy the main portion of this video, of course. If you don't, well, tough luck, because here it comes. For those unfamiliar, Rayman 3 is, you guessed it, the third main installment in the Rayman franchise. Despite what the name implies though, the Rayman games are not about a man who shoots rays, or is half stingray or anything like that, but rather a limbless
man. A vegetable. No. A thingamajig.
Whose fist can be launched and retrieved like a boomerang, and whose hair can turn into a helicopter propeller. In platformer games, i.e. games that involve a lot of running and jumping and other acrobatics and traversal, it's not uncommon for the main characters to be kind of strange or quirky in their designs, because it allows the developers to give them more unique abilities. For example, Banjo from Banjo-Kazooie is a bear who keeps his bird friend Kazooie in his backpack. Glover from Glover is a glove who balances on a ball. And Rocket from Rocket, Robot on Wheels, is exactly that. Well, he actually only has one singular wheel, but you get the point. Even by platformer protagonist standards though, Rayman is a bit of an oddball. In addition to the aforementioned propeller hair and weaponized self-dismemberment, he's acquired a number of additional abilities throughout the years, including the ability to become a sidekick in his own game and then disappear from it entirely. Obviously, the abilities a character has are one of the most important factors for what you as a level designer can and can't do. And since the implementation of abilities and power-ups in Rayman 3 is one of the most notable changes compared to the previous games, I concluded that this topic is the best starting point for analyzing the level design of the game. In Rayman 1 and 2, Rayman would start out with a limited set of abilities and permanently unlock more at specific points in the game. For example, in the very first level of the first game, he can't even attack at all, and the now iconic helicopter power isn't found until significantly later in the game. Other unlockable powers include the ability to run, hang from ledges, swing from hovering purple rings, and more. In the third game, however, Rayman already has all of his core abilities unlocked from the start, apart from the power to make a funny face, which is ironically one of the very few abilities he starts out with in the first game. Instead, the new abilities introduced in Rayman 3 are only available as temporary power-ups, in the form of magical costumes that can be found in specific locations, and they only last for a very limited period of time. Let's go through them briefly. The heavy metal fist basically boosts your attack power. It makes you deal more damage to enemies, break objects easier, including the point-filled piggy banks that are scattered everywhere. And most importantly, it allows Rayman to break down these specific kinds of wooden doors with scary faces on them. The lockjaw allows Rayman to shoot these sharp claws with chains attached from his fists. These can be used to swing from metal rings. The purple ones from the previous games are nowhere to be found. They can also be used to grab hold of enemies and shock them with electricity through the chains. The vortex power makes Rayman shoot little tornadoes from his fists. These can shrink down enemies to the point that you can squish them instantly by stepping on them. Additionally, they can cause spiral-shaped platforms to spin and lower like corkscrews. Very specific, I know, but luckily spiral-shaped platforms are very common in the world of Rayman 3. The shock rocket turns Rayman's fists into a missile that can be fired and controlled by the player to reach remote targets. And finally, the throttle copter, which is the only non-fist related power-up, gives Rayman a helicopter helmet that allows him to fly straight up, as opposed to his hair that can only be used to glide. This power wasn't entirely new, as it was something Rayman was able to do in the previous games as well, but only in a few specific levels. So, what's the lowdown on these new abilities? What exactly do they add to the gameplay formula? And is it good? First off, I like that these power-ups can be used in both exploration and combat. This type of multi-purpose functionality is always something I appreciate in games. Take the Shade Cloak from Hollow Knight, for example. From a level design standpoint, its main purpose is to dash through shade gates and reach new areas. But it can also be used to dash through enemies and through their attacks to avoid taking damage, which broadens your combat strategy options by a lot. Or, to use an example from another of my favorite games, the Ice Beam from the original Metroid trilogy. There are only a few places in each game where you actually need the Ice Beam to pass, but the ability to temporarily freeze most enemies and obstacles is immensely useful in all other areas of the game as well. In Metroidvania games especially, since they involve a lot of backtracking. It's a ton of fun to figure out all the different ways you can use your new abilities to more easily traverse previous areas. Some of the most frustrating sections from earlier, where you're jumping on tiny platforms over lava while constantly being assaulted by flying enemies, suddenly become a breeze now that you can just freeze those enemies and use them as platforms. However, Rayman 3 isn't exactly a Metroidvania. In fact, I'd say it's the most linear game in the series. Additionally, the very strict time limit, and the fact that power-ups only appear in specific spots, means you can never get too creative with them. There aren't really any optional power-ups or moments where you get to choose between them or think strategically about what to use them for. If you see a power-up, that means you have to use it somewhere in the immediate vicinity for one very specific purpose only, in order to continue. And if you see a $sign above the head of an enemy, that means he'll drop an item when killed, and 99% of the time it's a power-up. But if you think you can go, I don't need that, I'm cracked at this game, and just run past the guy, then you're wrong. Because again, if you see a power-up, you have to use it then and there. Now, you may think from my tone that I consider all of this to be negative, and a downgrade from the previous games, but that's not necessarily what I'm saying. I do think it's, let's say, anticlimactic, that these power-ups mostly serve as keys that you need to collect in order to move on to the next part of the level. For example, it's a bit underwhelming when something with such a badass name such as the Heavy Metal Fist turns out to be mostly used for opening doors. But again, it is also useful in combat, which is cool. And again, my examples from a moment ago were both from Metroidvania games, where the whole charm is about getting lost in giant mazes for hours, before you finally figure out how to progress. And that's never really been what Rayman has been about. As I mentioned, the previous games were somewhat less linear. They both had a level select section in the form of a world map with occasional branching paths. And at least one of the Hawk Twillion remakes and reimaginings of Rayman 2 even had a set of open world style hub levels and entirely optional side areas. And these games also have a few moments here and there where you're actually prevented from progressing until you return later with a new ability, just like in a typical Metroidvania. For example, the first game has this part when you get to the mountain world. You're allowed to enter the first level and attempt to play it, but if you don't have the power that lets you swing from rings yet, you can't get very far into the level at all. Instead, you're forced to exit the level and go back to a fork in the road earlier on the world map, and play another set of levels in order to acquire this skill. The second game has a couple of similar instances as well, such as when you enter the Cave of Bad Dreams, only to learn that you need to find a magical elixir in another level and return later. That said though, this only happens a couple of times in each game, and it's not like the levels themselves are designed to be explored in a non-linear fashion. In fact, the levels are full of one-way passages and are split into sections that often make it impossible to backtrack very far even if you want to. Therefore, if you're revisiting a level where you've missed a collectible halfway through, you have to go through every stage of that level and hope that you don't miss it. Because if you end up going to the next stage by accident, you have to replay the entire level again. To be fair, this is pretty common in platformer games, and in fast-paced games like Sonic or Mario, it's less of an issue. But Rayman levels are generally long and meandering, and often pretty maze-like and full of puzzles as well. It's especially bad in the first game, where some collectibles only appear when you pass by an invisible trigger point that can be located anywhere from inside a hidden passage to in the middle of the air. To its credit though, Rayman 1 wasn't even playtested at all outside of the dev team, which was still a semi-common mistake that studios did at the time. Considering that, the game could have easily turned out even more difficult and frustrating than it did. Although I have to confess that I haven't actually completed it, and if you have, you know why. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that the non-linear aspects of the early Rayman games aren't necessarily their strongest feature, and also not what they're most remembered for. I'd bet that if you did a survey like in that one American game show where you have to guess the most common answers to a question, and the question was about what your favorite part of Rayman 1 or 2 was, most people would mention the music, the characters, the environment, platforming, combat, and set pieces, before they would mention the part where you sometimes have to replay levels you've already beaten in order to find a power-up or some collectibles you missed. Not to mention that personally, I find it incredibly annoying when you're replaying a game and you try to use one of your character's abilities, only to remember that you won't unlock that ability until like 10 levels later. Although, I feel like most people don't seem to have a major issue with that, so I'm not gonna delve any deeper into that point. Anyway, considering all that I just spoke about, if I were one of the lead designers on Rayman 3, and someone asked me what to do about the world map and the sequence of abilities and collectibles that need to be found in order to progress past certain points, I could definitely see myself saying, fuck it, let's just scrap that stuff and focus our resources elsewhere. Of course, there is an alternate timeline out there, where the Rayman series went the Mario 3 route. That game went all in on branching world maps and giving you options and alternate routes. You can skip entire levels, pick up power-ups in one area and bring them with you to other levels, and use them there to access secrets and alternate paths. And if you find the super secret items, you can even skip entire worlds. And all of that might be an amazing Rayman game. But in this timeline, the Rayman 3 developers decided to go the opposite route and make the game entirely linear. The only incentive to replay levels, which is still a possibility through the main menu, is to improve your score and potentially unlock a few entirely optional minigames and bonus videos where the hoodlums dress various critters up as Rayman and shove batteries up their rectums. Which, now that I think about it, probably should have warranted a slightly higher Peggy rating. Anyway, in my view, the decision to axe the world map and backtracking, whether it was a conscious decision or just a result of having other priorities, was a valid one. Because like, if you've played Rayman 3, imagine if when you got to each of the doctors, they told you that you have to go back and replay previous levels and collect more cages and points before you're allowed to enter. Would that really have improved the overall gameplay experience? Personally, I don't think so. Another thing I appreciate about a game going full linear in its progression is that it gives the developers more freedom to scrap levels, or sections of levels, either because they didn't turn out as interesting as they looked in the concept art, or simply because you don't have the time to finish and polish them. That way you can focus more on making each remaining level stand out by giving it more unique and memorable features. If you've seen it, this is something I briefly touched upon in my previous video on Unreal. This feature can be a unique gameplay twist, a distinct visual element, or a theme, or anything else, as long as it allows players to easily describe the level to others. If one player can say to another, "Remember that level with the giant spider?" Or, "Remember that one room where the music suddenly gets really creepy?" I think that's a sign that you've created an experience that players will remember for a long time. The opposite of that is one player asking another about their favorite part, and they reply, "I really liked the fourth level of the jungle world," which doesn't really mean anything unless you've played the game enough times to remember the order of every single level. On the other hand, if your game has a bunch of branching paths and gated sections requiring you to backtrack and complete other objectives to enter, then it becomes a lot harder to just scrap sections like that. For example, you may have an area where the main level gimmick is just too complex to implement properly, or where it turns out that the artists don't have the time to finish all the unique graphical assets you had in mind. But since that area connects two other important areas, and also houses 3 out of the 50 power crystals needed to open the final boss door, then you can't just go, screw it, remove the whole thing. Instead, you'll be forced to make it work anyway somehow, by reusing assets and objects from other areas. If the overarching game flow is completely linear though, you can just scrap that level entirely. Why have a short and generic level that doesn't do anything unique, when you can just put more resources on the good and memorable levels? In fact, in such a linear game, you can even take scrapped bits of other levels and use them to make the remaining parts stand out more. For example, early design documents for Rayman 3 included an underwater world that ultimately got cut, but supposedly some of the assets were repurposed for this boss level. Now, the fact that the game even includes an underwater section at all feels like a bonus, rather than being forced to include an entire underwater world that just feels underwhelming and unfinished. That said though, it's not like Rayman 3 never reuses assets. In fact, there are some assets that reappear virtually unchanged in almost every single level of the game. Specifically, I'm referring to the hoodlum buildings. The hoodlums are a group of ne'er-do-wells who are the main enemies of the game, and they have a very distinct style of architecture. They build pretty much everything out of wooden planks and stretched cloth, or possibly animal hides. It's all red and orange for the most part, and they also include some other distinct features, like these pointed hat-looking roofs, and these flags with doodled figures on them. And the fact that these types of buildings appear pretty much everywhere in the game has both pros and cons from a design perspective. Firstly, I think this unified architectural style is useful for world building and storytelling. It contrasts well with the natural environment and with older structures, and really drives home the point that the hoodlums are an occupying settler force, and also very utilitarian-minded, with little sense for aesthetics or sustainability. For comparison, take the building style of the Teensies, who are among the primary long-time residents of Rayman's world. First off, their ancient stone structures have a generally bluish hue, which contrasts really well against the red and orange hoodlum tents. Additionally, it's also much more decorative than the hoodlum style, which is very clearly shown to be crude military fortifications, with no other purpose than being storage for guns and bombs and kid-friendly liquor, aka plum juice. Many of the worlds in this game also make use of this contrast in their level progression, where the first level has less hoodlum structures than the later ones, showcasing the natural environments becoming more and more overtaken by the hoodlums as you progress through the world. The negative aspect though is of course that this makes some areas less distinct from one another. On a level-to-level basis, I think each level does a good job of presenting unique set pieces, but individual sections can definitely have a tendency to blend together. For example, if you describe a level as the one with the magical ghost tower, or the one with the invisible flying platforms, or the one with the giant pillar where two Knarren argue about whose dad is the strongest.
My dad is stronger than your dad.
I think most Rayman 3 fans will immediately know what level you're talking about. However, if you just show them a screenshot of a cloth corridor full of plum juice crates, then they're gonna have a much harder time identifying which level that section is from. Aside from their architecture, the enemies themselves also have an effect on the level design. I do have some gripes with the term level design in itself, because I think a lot of people get it mixed up with environmental design. A level designer isn't just someone who draws maps and places down walls and trees and rocks in a level editor, but rather someone who arranges and tweaks all the game's elements in order to create a satisfying gameplay experience. This is why terms such as encounter designer and scenario designer are sometimes used instead of level designer, in order to separate it from environmental design. But that's a topic for another video. My point is that I'm gonna talk about enemy design for a while now, but as you'll hopefully come to understand, I'm also talking about level design, because the two are very closely linked. So, as I said, the hoodlums are the main enemies of Rayman 3, and they're essentially a paramilitary of cloth mechas, piloted by evil bugs and split into a number of distinct units. From standard foot soldiers and tiny flying guys, to big flying guys, spinning guys, and giant armored guys with toilet handles implanted in their necks. Some only appear a handful of times, and there are some other enemy types that are unaffiliated with the hoodlums who appear in certain areas. But for the most part, you'll encounter the same main enemy types repeatedly throughout most of the game. The most obvious benefit of having frequently recurring enemy types is that the programmers and designers can focus more of their resources on making these main foes interesting and exciting to fight, by testing and tweaking their behavior to make it as bug-free, balanced, and versatile as possible. Take the Hoodmonger, for example. He's the most common enemy type and appears in almost every single level, and therefore his behavior has to be adaptable to every type of area. He can pathfind, retreat, jump down ledges, and even perform blocks and melee attacks in close quarters. And although I don't have their code in front of me, or would understand it if I did, they clearly have some sort of squad behavior, where some Hoodmongers will try to remain in the back, or try to flank Rayman or seek high ground, and will only come closer once their comrades are defeated. They also have officers among them who appear later in the game, although their only apparent difference is that they have more health, fire 3 bullets at once, and sport snazzier outfits. Some of the other more common enemies include the Hoodmonger Soldiers, a Hoodmonger variant that fires rapid bursts of arrows instead of bullets, Hoodbooms, who throw explosives, usually from hard-to-reach spots above the battlefield, and the Hoodstormers, who fly around in the air and have a tendency to dodge unless you curve your punches, which is a vital combat technique that you need to know if you want to beat this game. Thanks to the versatility of this relatively small roster of common enemies, the level designers are able to create many different encounters simply by varying the combinations and formations of these enemies, as well as the environmental layout and hazards in the combat space. It's always very helpful for level designers when the enemies are well well tested enough that you can just plop them down in any environment and expect them to work, instead of having to copy a bunch of level data and invisible triggers and such from a programmer's test level. That said, to my fellow level designers out there, you will never have a work experience that's as smooth as a commercial level editor, so be grateful to your programmers. Another benefit of having a limited number of core enemies is that it allows the player to really familiarize themselves with each enemy type and learn how to deal with them almost instinctually. This way, the designers can slowly ramp up the difficulty by putting more and more enemy types together in bigger numbers without overwhelming the player. I don't remember the exact title, but there's a video that discusses this design philosophy in the context of the original Doom. I'm 90% sure it's a video by Decino, but if I haven't edited this line of the script by the time I'm recording it, then I haven't been able to find the video again to confirm this. Anyway, as I said, the guy argues that having fewer enemy types allows the player to more easily familiarize themselves with each one's behavior. He also talks about how the distinct silhouettes of each enemy adds to this rapid recognition factor, and also how the number 7 has been shown to be the average number of items that the average human can keep track of in their short-term memory at any given time, which is relevant because the first Doom game has 7 types of enemies. Now, Rayman 3 has quite a lot more than 7 enemy types, but the part of that video that I found the most relevant to this video is when he describes Doom's combat as a type of combat chess, in the sense that each enemy type presents a very different challenge depending on its position and what other enemy types are surrounding it. For example, the Pinky Demons in Doom are very easily dispatched in large open areas, since they only have melee attacks. But if you put them next to a shotgun soldier, this completely changes up the encounter, as these guys are devastating to fight if you don't have a corner or a pillar or something to hide behind. Similarly, you can just put the Pinky Demon in a narrow corridor or on top of a thin walkway, and suddenly they're a lot more scary. Additionally, by reusing enemy types to this extent, you don't have to spend as much level real estate on tutorials. Any level designer worth their salt knows that if you're gonna introduce a brand new enemy, you're probably gonna want to do it in an isolated and relatively safe situation, where the player can learn the enemy behavior without getting slaughtered immediately. Of course, Doom doesn't really do this, because it was developed during the Wild West of video games, where you could just do whatever you wanted, but hopefully you get my point. There are many good reasons for why you should try to get a lot of mileage out of your most well-designed enemy types. One good example of how enemies are reused in new situations in Rayman 3 is one of the very first enemies introduced at the beginning of the game, the Slapdash. On his own, the Slapdash is pretty much useless. He can be defeated with a single punch from any direction, and his only attack is to launch a very slow-moving boxing glove that does very little damage. Pretty much his only purpose initially is to serve as a punching bag for players to practice on, and the designers don't mince words when describing his ineptitude at putting up any real resistance. To quote character designer Stefan Zinetti, "We wanted to create a fat moron." That said, he has one very unique and arguably very annoying ability, which is the ability to materialize straight out of the ground with little to no warning. All other hoodlums are either shown idling in the distance before spotting Rayman, or arriving onto the scene on airships, by balloons, or by being carried by other enemies. But the Slapdash just seeps out of the ground somehow, like sewer water in a shower stall with shoddy plumbing. Thanks to this devious trick, the designers are able to throw this guy in at the worst moments, just infrequently enough that you're never prepared for it. Every now and then, they'll place a Slapdash spawn point right in front of a power-up or a door, or in the center of the narrow platform that you were just about to land on, or somewhere else equally frustrating. My favorite example, however, is during the first boss fight in the game, the battle against Master Cag, the legless infant hoodlum who turned his playground swing set into a steam-powered stomping machine. When I said that the Rayman franchise is known for its wacky characters, I didn't mean wacky as in quirky. I really meant wacky. Regardless, the goal of this fight is to step on these switches in the ground in order to make a shock rocket power-up appear. It's a typical 3-life boss battle, as is very common in platformer games. But can you guess what happens the third time you have to rush around between these buttons while avoiding getting squished? That's right, a cheeky little Slapdash spawns on top of each switch, which is pretty much guaranteed to have caught everyone off guard during their first playthrough. And if you think this sounds like something out of a so-called rage game, like I Wanna Be the Guy or Cat Mario, then yeah, it is a bit like that. Thankfully though, the Rayman designers have much more restraint than those guys, and only troll the player like this very sparingly, mostly in order to keep them on their toes. I also mentioned how some enemies can work very differently when paired up with other enemies, and Rayman 3 has a very interesting example of this type of synergy in the form of the Hoodoo. In fact, the Hoodoo is entirely a support enemy that can't actually damage Rayman at all, but rather creates magical shields around other enemies. He's also normally invisible and only appears for a few seconds when you're attacking the enemy he's defending, in order to maintain his shield. This way, your ability to turn around quickly and both attack and dodge in different directions is tested, as you have to attack one enemy in order to make the Hoodoo appear, and then switch to attacking the Hoodoo, while still avoiding the first enemy's attacks. In the first encounter, the Hoodoo only ever appears on a literal pedestal in the center of the arena, and is defending a regular hoodmonger. However, throughout the game you'll encounter Hoodoos protecting different enemy types, Hoodoos protecting other objects such as piggy banks and teensy cages, Hoodoos placed on ledges where the player has to take a detour in order to reach and destroy them, and even Hoodoos protecting other Hoodoos. This is a perfect example of how a creative designer can create many varied and memorable challenges while reusing a single enemy type in combination with other gameplay features. So that's pretty cool, but if you've figured out the formula of this script at this point, you know I'm also going to talk about the downsides of each thing I bring up. So what are the downsides of having an organized enemy force with a comparatively low number of core enemy types that reappear throughout the game? Well, obviously the first risk you run into as a designer is excessive repetition. Again, creating these types of combat chess scenarios doesn't happen automatically, just because you have a small roster of well-designed enemies to use. You still have to put them in different formations and situations, and change up the landscape so that each encounter feels unique. For the most part, Rayman 3 does this well, but if towards the end of the game you start to feel a bit burnt out from fighting groups of 3 to 4 hoodmongers in a semicircle where 1 or 2 of them is perched on a box or a ledge in the back, I don't blame you. There's also a conflict of priorities that arises when you're designing combat in this way in a game that's ultimately a platformer at its core. Because when you have enemies that are versatile enough to appear everywhere in the game, you're not really integrating them with the unique platforming elements and stage hazards found in each level. Take for example the Wrong Note enemy from Rayman 1. This guy only appears in the music-themed world of Bandland, as is evident by his design. More specifically, he appears on top of these bendy and slippery platforms inspired by staff and ledger lines from musical notation, sliding along them like, well, a musical note. This area also has other unique enemies, such as these disembodied hands using mallets to bang on drums, as well as these trumpet guys who use bursts of air to push and pull you along the staff lines. The drawback here is obviously that you can't reuse these guys anywhere else without ruining the visual cohesion of the level, but the benefit is that they work in tandem with the platforming elements they were designed for. In contrast, Rayman 3 sometimes feel like you're switching between 2 separate game modes, where each combat encounter is essentially just a roadblock preventing access to the next platforming section. This is most glaring when fighting some of the less common types of hoodlums. For example, the Spinneroo is this chainmail wearing guy with wrecking ball fists, who always guards a single spot, and the only way to defeat him is to either slowly knock him backwards into a pit or a fire, or to hit him with a fully charged heavy metal fist, meaning that for all intents and purposes, this guy is basically just a sentient door. The other downside to having enemies designed to appear anywhere is that it takes away some of the excitement of entering a new area, since you already know what kind of characters you can expect to encounter there. In the first game, most of the enemy types are unaligned with the villain of the game, Mr. Dark, and only seem to attack Rayman either because he's passing through their territory, or presumably because they want to eat him or something. Rayman 2 has the infamous robot pirate army that sort of serves as a precursor to the hoodlums, and in a similar fashion, they're found pretty much everywhere, capturing or chasing away the local population wherever they go. To be fair though, both Rayman 2 and 3 do feature a fair amount of other creatures as well. 2 has caterpillars, spiders, zombie chickens, and mini Janos, who are, as you might have guessed, smaller versions of a guy called Jano. 3 has ninja crabs, more zombie chickens, muddy bogs, which are some type of rock-slinging poop snails or something. These ugly things, and the Knaren, who are a civilization of tall underground creatures, and actually play a major role in the story in addition to the hoodlums. All Rayman games also have a higher than average amount of background critters that further add to the liveliness of the environments, like butterflies, sentient jumping mushroom caps, and masochistic mice. Actually, I feel bad about calling those things ugly earlier, because now that I'm looking at the wiki, they're literally called uglies. I take it back, uglies. It's also worth mentioning that Rayman 3 has a lot of cut characters from earlier in development, including a whole bunch of random animals such as the Snoot, the Glute, the Zack, the Goaty, the Glander, the Bonton, the Zoar, the unnamed water bug, and the Woogla. This indicates that the artists and designers always meant to feature plenty of wildlife, and simply had to limit their scope in that aspect for one reason or another. In fact, the models of many of these creatures can still be found as Easter eggs and secrets at various points in the game. And the Bonton is even prominently featured in the intro cutscene. Segueing away from the topic of background fauna, let's talk about the actual environments themselves. As I said earlier, the Rayman franchise has always been known for its very fantastical vibe. These games wouldn't be the same at all without their strong art direction and extremely creative and dedicated concept artists, illustrators, animators, and other artists. My favorite thing about the environments in most Rayman games is that they refuse to follow the typical platformer game tropes. Having seen 4 decades of Mario games and their competitors doing Grassy Hills World, Desert Pyramid World, Palm Tree Water World, Clouds and Rainbows World, and Lava and Castles World, I always welcome games that branch away from these predictable locales, and in this aspect Rayman 3 delivers in spades. And sure, some worlds are fairly conventional if you describe them briefly, like the forest, the swamp, and the snowy mountain worlds. But then you've also got this mirrors and stained glass palace world, the fairy temple overgrown with translucent flowers and floating jellyfish things world, the LSD trip as depicted in a cartoon world, and boxes full of booze world. A few areas even deliberately play with tropes in order to subvert your expectations. For example, when you're told to go to the land of the living dead, you'd expect a creepy graveyard-themed level, but when you get there, it's actually a very serene and ethereal Highlands and Stonehenge-themed world. Similarly, the Desert of the Knarren opens on a section with scalding hot sand and dry bone platforms, but then drops you through a crack in the floor into the underground city of the titular Knarren, as you're told that the only way to cross the desert is to go underneath it. And when it comes to the less fantastical worlds I mentioned earlier, it's not like they're bog-standard environments either. For example, the otherwise fairly generic Snowy Mountain world includes both a snowboarding section, as well as a stage set entirely on a ship in the ocean. The swamp level has the lair of Begoniax the Witch, as well as the massive mansion of Count Razov Shudzakovsky, the crazed big game hunter, who is implied to have shot and killed several other famous Rayman characters, such as Sam the Snake from Rayman 2. While this area is considered part of the swamp level, it's got an entirely different vibe, and features tons of unique assets that don't appear anywhere else, including, in addition to all the furniture and decor, the uglies that I mentioned earlier. When it comes to how these environments differ from a gameplay perspective, however, I'd say it's a bit of a mixed bag. As I mentioned before, there's a bit of a disconnect between combat encounters and platforming sections. Sometimes it can feel almost like an old beat-em-up game, where you're just continually walking in one direction and beating up groups of guys until the game tells you to continue, while the environments scroll by in the background. And even in terms of platformer obstacles, there are some gimmicks that are repeated a bit too often for my liking. For example, the game gets a lot of mileage out of these bouncy balloons, as well as the flying hooks that you swing from with the lockjaw. Sometimes they're even used together, but these sections are rarely very interesting in my opinion. Most of the time it's just one long line of balloons or hooks, with the occasional branching paths to the side letting you collect a few more score pickups. However, there are also plenty of sections with more unique and creative obstacles and challenges throughout the game. The Swamp World, for example, takes advantage of the characteristics of a swamp by including piranhas, boats, enemies on stilts, and the aforementioned muddy bogs. Sometimes you'll even catch them in the middle of fighting off the hoodlums, which is a fun detail. I always enjoy seeing characters interact with each other without any input from the player, as opposed to in some games where everyone is just standing around waiting for the player to approach. Another interesting level is the Longest Shortcut. The paradoxical name is emblematic of the Rayman franchise's irreverent surrealism, or randomness as we millennials call it. For whatever reason, this world doesn't feature any enemies whatsoever, and instead focuses entirely on time trial challenges and mirror gimmicks, where some platforms and doorways can only be seen in mirrored surfaces. While I wouldn't call this area my personal favorite, I really appreciate its existence. As I mentioned, Rayman 3 is more focused on combat than the previous games are, and this level specifically follows right after one of the most challenging boss fights, so in terms of pacing it serves as a nice diversion. It's also a clever example of how to make a level unique by removing a gameplay element, in this case combat, instead of adding something. A lesson to learn is that if you're a creative designer and can think outside of the box, you can create a memorable experience without having to ask the programmers for a single new feature. One level that feels a bit lacking though, and I hate to say this because from a thematic perspective it's my personal favorite, is the Clearleaf Forest. To its credit, it's the second world in the game, and therefore its main purpose is to tutorialize every major gameplay feature that didn't fit into the first one. These features include most of the power-ups I described in the beginning of this video, and unfortunately, this means that the level frequently becomes a demonstration of all the weakest points of the gameplay design. To illustrate what I mean, let me describe something I call the key test. The key test, or should I say the key question, is this. If you're considering adding an unlockable ability or gadget to your game, could it be replaced by a key and a locked door? For example, let's say you have a power-up that turns your character's hands into a pair of scissors, but the only thing you can use the scissors for is to cut down cobwebs that block specific doors. What then would be different if you just replaced the cobwebs with a door, and the power-up with a key to that door? You wouldn't lose any gameplay functionality, and you'd save the animators a whole lot of work. Not only that, but you'd probably also save the players from potential frustration if they run into some other situation that could logically be solved with a pair of scissors, like a rope holding up a drawbridge, or a machine that needs to be disabled through some kind of puzzle, even though it has clearly visible cables running from it that you should just be able to cut. Of course, I'm not saying that you have to replace all your character's unique abilities with keys and locks, but if you can, you may want to think about ways to make the ability more interesting. Maybe the scissors could also have a unique purpose against a certain enemy type, or you could have some puzzles that involve cutting ropes in a certain order. Ideally, if you've got a power-up like that in your game, you should make sure that every object that looks like it's able to be cut should be able to be cut. And if it's part of the background, you can try to make it a muted color and place it among other background objects, so that the player doesn't mistake it for something interactable. However, this level of design oversight is a tall order for any game studio that's made up of more than a handful of people, as it requires very close communication and cooperation between the art and design departments. And it can quickly become an impossible task once you start having to change, add, or remove features from the initial design document. Like, imagine you've just told the artists to go over every single large and prominent prop in the game, and remove or tweak every detail that looks like a rope or a string. And then a programmer informs you that you won't be able to implement the Scissorhands power-up in time for release, because of some technical issue. If your art team is just 2 or 3 people, then you can probably just message them on Discord and go, never mind actually, we're gonna have to change the scissor power-up, so don't bother with the whole rope and string thing we talked about earlier. On the other hand, if your art team is 100 people, or 1,000 people, or 10,000 people spread out over multiple continents and time zones, meaning that every major decision needs to be put through a team of supervisors during a coordinated meeting that can't happen until next week, then congratulations! You've just wasted thousands of dollars of development time and made 10,000 artists incredibly frustrated when they find out next week that all of last week's work was completely pointless. Anyway, going back to the key test, most of Rayman 3's power-ups do actually have dual purposes, in that they can also be used in combat. But aside from that, most of them still rank pretty high on the could be replaced by a key scale. More than anything else, it's the strict time limit that often reduces them to basically just a key whenever they appear, because they only last long enough to be useful for one specific and usually very obvious purpose. If there's a wooden door with a face on it, the heavy metal fist is the key. If you see a raised platform with a swirly pillar, you can be sure that a vortex fist will spawn nearby as soon as you defeat the last enemy or hit a switch or something. Hi, I don't know exactly where in the video I'll end up putting this segment, but here are a couple of extra scattered thoughts and observations that I had that I couldn't fit into the main script. The Matuvus and Tribels are 2 types of additional collectibles that I didn't mention, and I think they're pretty cool. They're 2 types of little creatures that can give you extra points if you find them, but you can't just run up to them and collect them. Obviously, they're not usually found out in the open in the middle of your path, but rather tucked away in a corner or hidden area somewhere. The best way to find them is to listen for them, as they both make very distinct sounds. The Tribels are very shy and will disappear if you approach them too quickly, and therefore you have to walk up to them really slowly if you want them to give you bonus points. Personally, I find this pretty annoying, since there's no way to know how slow is slow enough, but at least it's something unique to do that differentiates them from regular score pickups. The Matuvus, on the other hand, are among my favorite types of collectibles, because they're often placed on ceilings or out-of-the-way spots like high up on walls, tree trunks, or other props and doodads. To get their points, you have to focus on them with the first-person look mode, and in my opinion this is perfect in a game like Rayman, where there are so many fun little details in the environment that you'll easily miss if you never stop to look around. It reminds me of the photo op collectibles in GTA San Andreas, and I always love when a game encourages you to stop and take a closer look at things. Unfortunately, this occasionally exposes some mistakes that are normally not seen with the third-person camera, such as these bookshelves not having textures on the underside. Again, it just goes to show how important it is to define your player character's abilities and make sure everyone in the team knows about them. If you're gonna allow the player to switch from a third person to a first person view, then definitely let your artists know that as soon as you can. Another small detail I really appreciate about the level design in this game is how abstract it gets sometimes, especially in secret areas. I've already shown how surreal and dreamlike many of these environments are, but in some of the more well-hidden locations, the vibe goes from surreal to straight up salvia trip mode. Lastly, and I do talk about this here and there throughout the video, but I really want to emphasize one more time just how much this game is elevated by its atmosphere, art direction, and general level direction. Like, sure, if you isolate and dissect each and every section of a level and look at it from a pure and sterile gameplay perspective, then most of them aren't gonna seem mind-blowing. You do a bit of jumping here and climbing there, some swinging and bouncing and switch hitting in a mostly non-linear fashion. Big whoop. But like, it's so much more than that if you think about it holistically or whatever. It's not just an obstacle course, it's an adventure, man. And there are so many little things that add to that feeling. From the discrete light and fog effects that you hardly ever pay attention to the way the music is switched up to a different tempo or a different theme when you start to swing across a pit, fall through the floor into the creepy basement, or even when you pick up a plum. Then there's all the ambient noises, the funny idle animations and short cutscene gags, as well as the general pacing of the whole thing. As I said earlier, Rayman 3 isn't exactly a speedrunning game like Mario or Sonic, but it's not one of those 90s PC platformers either, where you've got 400 levels of identical mazes that are all designed to fill up every single tile of the map. No offense to whatever is on the screen right now, of course. Instead, Rayman 3 simply presents you with a big smorgasbord of fun gameplay ideas and cool environments. And before any of them start to drag the pace down, the game moves on to the next one. It may sound like a stupid observation, but I think the strongest point of Rayman 3's level design is that it focuses on being fun. Again, it's like, yeah, of course you want your game to be fun, but the most important skill of any type of designer is to know your target audience. And different audiences have very different ideas of fun. For example, even though they're both side-scrolling platformers, you're probably not gonna be able to make a game that's pleasing to both die-hard Super Meat Boy fans and the Thomas Was Alone fandom. I'm not saying you shouldn't try if you really want to, but like, good luck. In short, I think the Rayman 3 designers understood their audience very well, and so if you're the type of person to look at this cover and say, that looks fun, then you're most likely gonna have fun. But if you're looking at this cover and thinking, meh, I bet you can't even exploit the physics and sit in a corner for hours to build up enough speed to travel through parallel universes in this game, then I think you should pass on this game and go back to making YouTube videos. And that's about it. I've now said everything there is to say about the level design of Rayman 3. At least, I've said everything that feels meaningful to say, without recording an entire playthrough. That's just me pausing every 10 seconds and drawing circles and arrows everywhere. But if you'd like to see that, let me know in the comments. I mean, I won't actually do it, because I could never fit all that footage on my hard drive. But let me know either way. And speaking of footage, just like in my last video, I'd like to give a big thanks to everyone who I've kindly been allowed to borrow gameplay footage from. And also everyone at the Rayman Wiki, and everyone who posts free-to-use sounds and music at freesound.org, and everyone else who fills this wonderful place we call the internet with useful information and resources, and content that educates and entertains, and inspires other people to share what they know in return, adding to this great database of human knowledge, passion, and creativity. And that's all. End video.